9 years after leaving the White House, Barack Obama still occupies a permanent suite in Donald Trump's head. He does not campaign against him. He does not launch daily attacks. He does not even bring the subject up unprompted. Yet Trump cannot stop reaching for him. In speeches, in press conferences, in the middle of the night on Truth Social, in the middle of completely unrelated controversies. A reflecting pool renovation becomes an opportunity to invent numbers about Obama's past spending. A war briefing becomes a chance to relitigate a nuclear deal signed more than a decade earlier. A single 24-hour span once produced 55 separate posts accusing the former president of treason and demanding his arrest. Obama's response has remained remarkably consistent across every format and every interviewer. Not outrage, not a counteroffensive, not the performance of grievance, just a kind of quiet, almost amused diagnosis. On the podcast, All the Smoke, sitting with two retired NBA players in a low-stakes conversation about basketball and life after the arena, he said it with a laugh still audible in his voice. I obviously have a room in his head, a suite in his head. Then he delivered the observation that actually cuts deeper than any insult could. When I was president, the last thing I had time to do was worry about what somebody said or what my predecessor did. They're gone. I've got work to do. That fixation, he continued, shows a man who is not focused on the American people and the job he is supposed to be doing. The setting itself was part of the message. Trump reaches for Truth Social at all hours, framing his predecessor as a criminal and a threat to the republic. Obama reaches for a casual basketball podcast and, almost as an aside between stories about pickup games, delivers a more precise character assessment in 2 sentences than most late-night tirades manage in dozens of posts. One man has moved on, building libraries, opening museums, appearing on relaxed conversations, even admitting his own shortcomings in public. The other man, 9 full years later, still cannot stop measuring himself against the president he replaced. That imbalance is not a side detail. It is the entire story. The fixation did not begin when Trump returned to office. It has a long, continuous paper trail that predates his first inauguration and has never fully gone dormant. In 2011, Trump became the most prominent national amplifier of the birther conspiracy, spending years promoting the false claim that Obama had been born in Kenya and was therefore constitutionally ineligible to serve as president. The claim was repeated across television appearances, interviews, and public statements until political reality made it untenable. Even then, a full and unambiguous apology never arrived. The episode simply receded, leaving behind a clear demonstration of the lengths to which Trump was willing to go to undermine the legitimacy of the man who held the office before him. In May 2026, the same underlying impulse returned at industrial scale. Over a single 24-hour span, Trump posted 55 times. Multiple posts reshared or endorsed language that labeled Obama a traitor and demanded his arrest for seditious conspiracy and an alleged plot against the government. The rhetoric was the kind normally reserved for wartime enemies or active domestic threats, not for a private citizen whose public activities consist primarily of writing, philanthropy, and occasional media appearances. Earlier that year, the same platform carried a racist AI-generated video that depicted both Barack and Michelle Obama as apes. The post provoked immediate and bipartisan condemnation. Republican Senator Tim Scott publicly described it as the most racist thing he had seen emerge from the White House. The video was eventually deleted. No apology followed. When journalists raised legitimate questions about cost overruns connected to a Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool project, Trump's response was not a defense of the current work on its own merits. It was an immediate, unprompted pivot to the former president, and a fabricated claim that Obama's earlier renovation of the same pool had exceeded $100 million. An Associated Press review later established that the actual figure was approximately $34 million. The invented number served a single purpose: to make the predecessor appear wasteful in the middle of an unrelated controversy. Even the physical structure of the Obama Presidential Center was drawn into the grievance list. Trump publicly described the newly opened building as very unattractive and a total disaster, then contrasted it with the library he promised he would one day build on time, on budget, and in the best possible location. The architectural judgment of a museum in Chicago had somehow become a matter requiring the attention of the sitting president of the United States, 9 years out of office, no formal authority, no organized campaign against the current administration. and still one of the most reliable objects of presidential focus. The pattern is not driven by continuous attacks from Obama. It is driven by Trump's apparent inability to encounter discomfort, criticism, or an unfavorable comparison without reaching for the predecessor as both explanation and target. The paper trail is extensive, consistent, and public. It records a man who has never fully exited the previous chapter of the story. On June 18, 2026, the Obama Presidential Center opened in Chicago in a ceremony deliberately framed as a celebration of Democratic continuity rather than personal triumph. Former Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Joe Biden attended with their first ladies. Musical performances came from Bono, Bruce Springsteen, Stevie Wonder, and John Legend. The guest list and the programming emphasized institutional memory and the peaceful transfer of power across parties. Donald Trump was not among those invited. A senior official of the Obama Foundation stated that he would be welcome to visit at a later date. The omission required no further commentary. Obama spoke for roughly half an hour and never once pronounced Trump's name. The restraint was strategic and effective. The lines were written tightly enough to land without the explicit target. He spoke of the approaching 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and returned to its central radical claim that the new nation would contain no kings or lords, no serfs or subjects, only citizens. He cautioned against those who treat government primarily as a system for distributing spoils, punishing political enemies, and enforcing hierarchies of belonging. He described the peaceful transfer of power after free and fair elections as a foundational value that every president present in the room that day, Republican and Democrat, had honored. The contrast with the period after the 2020 election was left unspoken yet unmistakable. He observed that his own Republican opponents in the 2008 and 2012 campaigns, John McCain and Mitt Romney, had shared a commitment to those democratic norms equal to his own, drawing a clear historical line between an earlier version of the party and the one currently exercising power. At the same ceremony, Obama did something that remains almost entirely missing from Trump's public repertoire. He volunteered an accounting of his own limitations. He recalled the plaque he kept on the Resolute desk that read, "Hard things are hard." He told the audience directly that his administration had not achieved everything it set out to accomplish. No administration does. Some of the exhibits inside the new center, he said, would reflect unfinished business, and in certain cases, his own shortcomings and mistakes. When Michelle Obama began to list his achievements, the cameras caught him looking downward, visibly uncomfortable with sustained public praise on a day dedicated to his legacy. Later, he joked that she had deliberately kept the speech from him so she could mess him up. The discomfort and the humor were unforced. They stood in direct opposition to a public style built on the daily, unapologetic assertion of personal exceptionalism. The ceremony never required Trump's name to complete its arguments. The curated absences, the historical references, and the voluntary admissions of fallibility performed the contrast without assistance. The morning after the center's opening, Obama sat for a televised interview and was asked about the war with Iran that was then already well underway. His answer remains one of the most carefully constructed and consequential assessments any former president has offered of a sitting president's major foreign policy undertaking. "We've now fought a war, spent billions and billions of dollars, put enormous strain on our military. A lot of people have died, and it feels like we're back where we were before we started the war, except maybe a little bit worse off." The phrase "worse off" was chosen with precision. It did not claim catastrophe in every dimension. It claimed net deterioration relative to the pre-war baseline, higher costs, greater strain, significant loss of life, and a strategic position that did not represent clear improvement. He then supplied the causal link that made the assessment difficult to dismiss as mere partisanship. His own administration had negotiated the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, under which Iran accepted verifiable restrictions on its nuclear program and surrendered the large majority of its enriched uranium. A prior iteration of the current administration had withdrawn from that agreement. The withdrawal, Obama stated, contributed directly to Iran's subsequent reconstitution and expansion of nuclear capacity, the same capacity later cited as the primary justification for the military campaign that had already consumed more than $113 billion and an undisclosed but substantial number of lives. He separated analysis from desire. He stated that he was very happy a ceasefire had been reached and that he hoped it would hold. The hope was expressed without apparent partisan calculation. The ceasefire did not hold. Within weeks, the conflict had returned to a third consecutive night of American strikes, a reimposed naval blockade, public and undignified haggling over the precise percentage of a shipping toll on the Strait of Hormuz while missiles were still in the air, and the expansion of hostilities into additional countries that had not been parties to the original dispute. The trajectory tracked the worse-off description with uncomfortable fidelity. The contrast in diplomatic method was equally stark. The original nuclear agreement had emerged from nearly 2 years of disciplined multilateral negotiation involving the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany and the European Union. It produced a detailed, monitorable technical framework. What the public observed in 2026 was improvised bargaining conducted in significant part through social media posts, competing declarations of authority over a critical waterway, and the absence of any comparable verification architecture, all against the immediate background of active combat. The difference was not cosmetic. It was the difference between institutionalized statecraft and real-time improvisation under fire. Obama's assessment required no raised voice and no personal abuse to remain damaging. The subsequent military and diplomatic record performed the validation. When the daily noise of posts, images, fabricated figures, and personal accusations is cleared away, the year resolves into one sustained and increasingly undeniable contrast. One man left the presidency 9 years earlier. He spent the intervening time building a major civic institution, supporting community initiatives, writing, and appearing in settings that ranged from formal ceremonies to casual conversations about basketball. When asked about his successor, he answered with restraint and specificity. When he described the fixation, he did so with a quiet laugh and a single diagnostic sentence. The obsession itself demonstrates a failure to focus on the actual responsibilities of the office. When he evaluated the war, he used measurable outcomes and a clear causal sequence rather than character assault. He expressed genuine hope that a ceasefire would succeed even when that outcome would reduce the force of his own critique. The other man, still in possession of the office, has treated the predecessor as a permanent reference point and frequent target. He has posted at extreme volume accusing a private citizen of the most serious crimes against the state. He has circulated racist AI-generated imagery and removed it only after bipartisan condemnation, without apology. He has invented numerical claims to diminish past public works. He has evaluated the architecture of a museum as a presidential matter. He has converted questions about an ongoing war into opportunities to reopen grievances that predate his current term. A presidency secure in its own achievements does not require a predecessor as a continuous measuring stick nearly a decade later. It sets goals, pursues them, and allows history to conduct the longer comparisons. The persistent need to reach for Obama's name across domains as different as national security and interior design functions as evidence of a different psychology, one that experiences the prior standard as a standing rebuke rather than as settled history. Obama's public conduct since leaving office suggests he has released any corresponding need. He opens institutions. He participates in ordinary conversations. He acknowledges failure without external compulsion. One man continues to organize significant emotional and communicative energy around a figure who exited the stage years earlier. The other constructed the library, placed a plaque that admitted difficulty, and directed his attention elsewhere. That contrast does not depend on anger for its force. It does not depend on volume. It depends only on the continuing public record of one man who cannot relinquish the comparison and another who already has. 9 years on, the gap is not narrowed. The sheer durability of the fixation implies that at some level Donald Trump recognizes the gap, which may be the most complete explanation for why the suite remains occupied and why the quiet former president continues to live there without effort or rent. By the time the second half of 2026 was fully underway, the phrase Obama had offered almost casually on a basketball podcast had stopped sounding like a witty observation and started sounding like a structural diagnosis of the entire presidency. I obviously have a room in his head, a suite in his head. The line required no further embellishment because the public record kept furnishing new evidence on a near-weekly basis. Donald Trump continued to reach for Barack Obama in contexts that had no logical connection to the former president. A question about infrastructure spending became an opportunity to invent figures about past renovations. A briefing on the Iran war became a chance to reopen the 2015 nuclear agreement and assign blame backward across nearly a decade. A quiet news cycle was enough to produce another concentrated burst of truth social posts that recycled the language of treason, coups, and arrest. The suite did not require Obama to keep speaking. It sustained itself through Trump's inability to leave the subject alone. What made the pattern especially revealing was its one-sidedness. Obama almost never introduced Trump unprompted. When interviewers or audiences raised the subject, he answered with the same restrained, slightly puzzled tone he had used on the podcast, the tone of a man who had completed his chapter and kept being asked to reread it for someone else's benefit. He did not schedule appearances for the purpose of attacking the current administration. He did not flood social media with counter-accusations. He built the presidential center, appeared at its opening, acknowledged his own unfinished business in public, and then returned to the lower intensity work of writing, convening, and supporting civic projects. The contrast in emotional expenditure was stark. One man treated the predecessor as an occasional, almost reluctant topic. The other treated the predecessor as a permanent gravitational center around which large portions of public communication continued to orbit. The Iran conflict supplied the harshest possible measuring stick for the cost of that orbit. A war that had already consumed more than $100 billion, expanded into additional countries, disrupted a critical energy choke point, and produced repeated cycles of pause and collapse, demanded sustained strategic attention, alliance management, and public clarity about objectives. In that environment, every block of presidential bandwidth spent relitigating a 9-year-old agreement or generating fresh personal attacks on a private citizen represented attention not spent on the live variables that still determined whether the Strait of Hormuz would stabilize, whether another ceasefire would hold, or whether the human and economic toll would continue to climb. The opportunity cost was not abstract. It was visible in the gap between the gravity of the present tense crisis and the frequency with which the public conversation was pulled backward toward a man who no longer held power. Obama's own comments about the war had been characteristically precise. He had noted the expenditure, the strain on the military, the loss of life, and the uncomfortable sense that the strategic position was no better and perhaps slightly worse than the position that existed before the first strikes. He had linked the current difficulty to the earlier decision to abandon the diplomatic framework that had removed the large majority of Iran's enriched uranium without military action. He had expressed genuine hope that a ceasefire would succeed. When that ceasefire failed and the conflict intensified, the earlier assessment required no updating to remain relevant. The record simply continued to move in the direction he had described. Meanwhile, the personal fixation showed no sign of exhausting itself. The AI-generated imagery, the invented cost figures, the architectural insults directed at the presidential center, the repeated returns to the language of criminality, all of it continued to appear even as the war absorbed more resources and more attention. The suite in the head was not a metaphor that needed reinforcement from Obama. It was a description that Trump's own output kept validating in real time. There is a deeper political psychological point embedded in the imbalance. A presidency confident in its own achievements and clear in its own objectives has little need to keep a predecessor on permanent retainer as a measuring stick or a villain. It governs, accepts the constraints of the present, and allows historical judgment to arrive on its own schedule. The persistent need to diminish Obama across domains as unrelated as nuclear policy and interior design functions as evidence of a different orientation, one that experiences the prior standard as an active rebuke rather than as settled history. The energy devoted to that diminishment is energy unavailable for the harder work of defining and delivering present tense results that could stand on their own. Obama's post-presidential conduct has offered the opposite model. He has not spent the years since 2017 constructing an identity around opposition to the man who followed him. He has built institutions, supported community efforts, written, spoken when asked, and on multiple public occasions, chosen to acknowledge limits and failures without external pressure. The refusal to remain locked in the old rivalry is itself a form of power. It leaves the other party shouting into a space that is no longer occupied by an active opponent. By late 2026, the dynamic had become self-perpetuating. Obama did not need to re-stimulate the cycle. Trump's continued returns to the subject through posts, through interview pivots, through visual ridicule, kept the suite occupied and kept the contrast visible. Every new burst of attention directed at the former president supplied fresh confirmation of the original diagnosis. The man who claimed to be focused on the future could not stop organizing significant portions of his public voice around a figure from the past. The man who had left office years earlier continued to demonstrate, simply by living his life at a lower emotional temperature, that the fixation was optional. The war did not pause for the obsession. The obsession did not pause for the war. And the quiet observation first offered on a basketball podcast continued to accumulate supporting evidence with every passing week that the sitting president found another reason to reopen the door to the suite he could not bring himself to close. One man had described the room. The other man kept living in it. The description required no further advertisement. The occupancy itself remained the proof. As the months advanced, the original observation Obama had offered with a quiet laugh on a basketball podcast continued to gain mass. It no longer floated as a clever line. It settled into the foundation of the public record like a structural beam that every new event only reinforced. I obviously have a room in his head, a suite in his head. By this stage of 2026, the statement required no defense and almost no repetition. Donald Trump kept performing the proof. A news cycle that should have been dominated by the live variables of the Iran war, the status of the Strait of Hormuz, the durability of any pause in strikes, the positions of Gulf partners, the economic consequences of prolonged disruption, would instead bend, sometimes within a single answer, back toward the former president. A question about present tense military or diplomatic choices became an opportunity to reopen the 2015 nuclear agreement and assign original sin to the man who had negotiated it. A controversy over costs or aesthetics at a public site became an unprompted exercise in diminishing Obama's past decisions. The suite did not stay occupied because Obama kept sending new messages into it. It stayed occupied because Trump could not stop walking back through the door. The imbalance of emotional labor had become one of the defining features of the relationship. Obama's public references to Trump remained rare, almost always reactive, and consistently low temperature. When he spoke about the war, he used expenditure figures, strategic outcomes, and a careful causal sequence linking the withdrawal from the earlier diplomatic framework to the later military predicament. When he spoke about the fixation itself, he used the language of diagnosis rather than combat. He did not schedule events for the purpose of keeping the rivalry alive. He opened a presidential center, acknowledged his own unfinished business in front of cameras, returned to writing and convening, and allowed long stretches of time to pass without engaging the subject at all. Trump's references moved in the opposite direction, frequent, often unprompted, and routinely escalated to the language of criminality, existential threat, and personal ridicule. The volume required to sustain the fixation was supplied almost entirely from one side. That asymmetry carried practical consequences inside an active war. A conflict that had already drawn in additional countries, threatened a waterway carrying a substantial fraction of global oil traffic, and consumed more than $100 billion, demanded continuous high-quality attention from the highest levels of government. Every sustained burst of presidential communication devoted to a private citizen who had left office years earlier represented a measurable diversion from that demand. The diversion was not abstract. It appeared in the gap between the gravity of the strategic situation and the frequency with which the public conversation was pulled into retrospective grievance. Officials could brief, negotiators could work, and military planners could adjust. But the signal coming from the top kept demonstrating that a significant share of emotional and communicative bandwidth remained allocated to a contest the other party had largely stopped fighting. Obama's earlier assessment of the war itself continued to track events with uncomfortable accuracy. He had described a campaign that spent enormous resources, imposed heavy strain, produced significant loss of life, and left the United States in a position that felt no better, and in some respects worse than the position that existed before the first strikes. He had tied that outcome to the prior decision to abandon a diplomatic architecture that had removed the large majority of Iran's enriched uranium without military action. When ceasefires collapsed, when strikes resumed for third and subsequent nights, when the conflict widened geographically, and when public bargaining over shipping tolls replaced quiet technical negotiation, the Warsaw formulation required no revision. Reality simply continued to move in the direction he had indicated. Meanwhile, the personal dimension of the fixation showed no sign of natural exhaustion. The AI-generated imagery, the fabricated numerical claims, the architectural insults directed at the presidential center, the repeated returns to accusations of treason and coup plotting, all of it continued to surface even as the war absorbed more blood and treasure. The suite in the head was not a rhetorical flourish that needed periodic restatement from Obama. It was an operational description of how presidential attention kept being allocated. Every new episode supplied an additional data point confirming that the former president remained a primary reference point and a primary target long after he had ceased to be a primary actor. Underneath the specific episodes lay a more general political truth. Presidencies that are confident in their own theory of the case and their own measurable results have little structural need to keep a predecessor on permanent call as either measuring stick or villain. They define success in present tense terms and leave the longer historical comparison to scholars and voters at a later date. The sustained requirement to diminish Obama across policy domains and symbolic ones alike pointed toward a different internal logic, one in which the prior standard still functioned as an active source of pressure rather than as completed history. The energy devoted to neutralizing that pressure was energy unavailable for the more difficult work of producing results that could stand without constant reference to what came before. Obama's post-presidential path had illustrated the alternative. He had not constructed the years since 2017 as an extended exercise in opposition. He had built, written, convened, and when asked, answered. On more than one public occasion, he had chosen to inventory his own limitations without being forced. That refusal to remain locked inside the old rivalry functioned as its own form of power. It left the other participants speaking, posting, and escalating inside a contest that no longer had two active combatants. By the later months of the year, the cycle had become nearly automatic. Obama did not need to apply new stimulus.